tailored to y'all. Okay, I'm gonna go ahead and jump in. We're at the 35. Hi everyone, appreciate y'all being here. In the chat, if you could share where you're dialing in from, and what would be most helpful for me to touch on today. We're gonna cover a lot of ground around interviews and interview prep. This is super we're gonna give you really tactical things that you can use after this. It's really, really important to me that you walk away with like real next steps. So if you also want to share like what would be most helpful to talk about today, that would be great. And then I can make sure I incorporate that feedback too. So intros, we've got people from all over, South Texas, Davis, Pittsburgh, New York. So we're going to talk about why storytelling matters. We're going to talk about how to identify what stories you should be preparing when you're going into interviews, or it's like similar kinds of professional conversations, how to structure your interview answers using the STAR method, which some of you might be familiar with, but we'll do a refresher on that. And then we'll actually do a little bit of practice. So if you are able to unmute today, that would be great because it's interview prep. So we would love to actually kind of practice storytelling a little bit. And we'll leave time for Q&A at the end. All right. So storytelling. One of the things that I like to talk about with storytelling is I think when people think about the job search, it feels often like very clinical or almost feels like really, really impersonal. One of the reasons we started Forward is people kept telling us like, it just feels like a really dehumanizing process. And I think one of the interesting tensions of job searching is that it does feel really impersonal a lot of the times, but it is also a deeply human process. I talk to recruiters and like hiring managers and people all day long, and they're really just like people trying to vibe out other people. And so when you are, let's say, at a party or you are in a new class or a new gathering of people, you are trying to get a vibe of who that person is. The best way to connect with people we know is through stories, and getting a sense of who that person is. And your gut sort of reacts of like, is this person like what I think they are, who they say they are, all of that. Like, it's just a very normal human way that we interact with one another. And actually the job search process is not that different. Of course, we have a lot of structure in place with things like, uploading resumes, and we have like structured, questions that get asked and all of that. But like, it's so much of like people trying to connect with other people and trying to get their point of view and their values across. And so knowing that people respond inherently to stories is something I like to remind folks of. And again, this is not just coming like because this is like la-di-da and like, it feels, good to say that. And it's like about feel good things. It's like, this is what I hear from people who are decision makers all day long. So crafting a story that is authentic and impactful is really important for them to get a sense of who you are. So that's sort of the thing that I'm grounding us in today. So I just wanted to name that. Okay, so let's get right into the nitty-gritty of identifying stories that you would bring up in an interview. And that could be like a behavioral interview, an informational interview. It could just be like you're out networking in the wild and you want to be able to speak to your skill set. But let's just assume a typical like behavioral interview is like the context for today. Identifying your top stories. So probably the most common question I get asked when it comes to interviews is like, how do I prepare for an interview when I don't know what they're going to ask me? It's a very understandable question. You may not know what they're going to ask, but you do know what you're going to talk about. You know what, jobs or projects or volunteer experiences or whatever you're probably going to end up referencing because it's a big part of, what you're bringing to the conversation. So you can have those in the back of your mind. So thinking about work that you've done where you had a really big role in getting something done, you had some sort of leadership that you did, you took some really extraordinary steps to make something happen. Like, that's the first kind of way to think about what stories would I want to prepare going into an interview. What, specifically were you assigned to do? What were you trying to tackle? Whatever. What steps did you take to get the thing done? This is the thing that is the biggest miss, and we'll talk about this with the STAR method. I've interviewed a lot of people. I've like seen a lot of people prepare for interviews. The biggest mistake people make is that they spend a lot of time like on the setup of the story where they're like giving all the background on like what they were going to be doing and why they were doing it, but they don't talk about how did they get it done. So it's really important to talk about the steps that you took to get things done. And then of course, like, did you pull it off? What was the impact of your work? So this is the first like high level obvious lens of like, how do you prepare stories? And I'm going to go even more detailed in that the next slide. But before I do, I want to pause here and see if people have any immediate questions or things I can clarify so far. Okay. I appreciate the feedback in the chat. It's super helpful, especially if you can't unmute. Okay, so again, if you don't know what they're going to ask, but especially I would say for early career interviews, you know the themes that are going to come up. And I know there's a lot of text on this page. I'm going to send you all these slides after the fact. So don't worry about like trying to write all this down now. And I'll keep this slide up for our like live brainstorming that we'll do just now. But these are like broadly, I would say the 4 categories I see most often with behavioral interviews on a general level. Like any company or any job might ask some version of these questions. So top left, teamwork and leadership related stuff. So like how you work with others, how you lead others. So the classic, like when have you worked with someone you didn't get along with, or maybe it'll be phrased like you had different working styles, you had different priorities, but like when did you work sort of in conflict with someone? When did you have to step up when something didn't go according to plan? Another one I really like is who's your favorite manager to work with and why? Because people are trying to get a sense of like how you like to be managed. Then there's the adaptability time management questions, which is how have you managed multiple projects at the same time? People really want to understand like you were a student, you were a student athlete, you were in student organizations, like how did you do all of those things at the same time? That makes you extremely valuable to an employer. The favorite, tell me about a time you failed, which we can talk about that question if people are like, I hate that question, how do I answer it? So we can talk about that if people want. And then the other one I really like is when you had to teach yourself a new skill, because particularly for early career, again, I talk to a lot of employers, like they don't expect you to know everything when you walk in the door, right? Or if you're in like joining an industry and you're a little bit newer to it, whatever it might be, they don't expect you to have all the answers, but they want to see like, can you make things happen even if you may not have all the answers immediately? So anytime you've had to be scrappy and like make something happen, those stories are super, super powerful. Top right, communication related questions. So when did you have to convince someone to see something your way? Or when did you have to get a bunch of people on board with an idea, right? Like that kind of vibe. Anytime you've had to do a big presentation, like how did you approach that? How did you handle when things were not clear? Because again, in a job, like practically, like that's going to happen. You may not have clear instructions or clear expectations. So what steps do you take to kind of get that clarity? And then finally, like organizational project management, like how do you keep people up to date? Like how do you work on a team and keep things like coordinated? How do you manage a project and make sure you're like moving, moving along the way that you want to? So a lot of these questions all have overlap with each other. These are just meant to kind of spark some ideas. And now I'm not suggesting you need to create 11 stories here with each of these questions. The point I'm making is like when you think about this slide, which is like high level, what are the big things that you've done to date in the classroom and internships and jobs and whatever, and run them through the lens of this as well. And I'll show an example later of what this can look like in practice. But if you, for example, had to run a event, chances are when you were running the event, you had to work with a team and you might have not gotten along with someone on the team. When you plan that event, you had to keep some sort of like status update going of like the weekly progress of the event. You had to communicate with external stakeholders. Maybe you had to find like marketing dollars. Maybe you had to teach yourself some new like marketing platform you'd never used before. There's so many layers to the projects that you've worked on that tie to these themes. And if you really think about those super rich stories, there's a lot of angles to it, and you prepare those stories ahead of time and you get super comfortable and familiar with them, you can answer a lot of different interview questions through these lenses without having to, again, prepare like 25 different potential answers. I'm going to pause and see if this makes sense, how I've framed this, and take a sip of water. Okay, I'll keep an eye on the chat. What we're gonna do, we want a story. Yes, exactly. So I'll jump ahead since it's a small group, we can do whatever we want. Here's an example, right? So I'll give you all a second to read this slide. This is obviously a fake answer. So take a second to read this. So this story could be used to answer, tell me about a time that you had to see a project through from beginning to end. Tell me about a time you had to build brand partnerships, or you had to raise money, or you had to teach yourself a new skill, or you had to plan an event, or whatever, right? Like this story, there's a lot of different pieces to it. But it's not rambly, it's not like overly long, it sounds very conversational. And if I get really good at like knowing my own story, like these are my own experiences, right? So like if I get comfortable talking about it, then depending on the question I was asked, maybe I'll spend a little bit more time talking about certain elements, right? So if somebody had asked me, tell me about a time you raised money, maybe I would spend even more time talking about the fact that I found influencers who had done a really good job with other like nonprofit like campaigns. If they had asked about brand partnerships, maybe I would have spent a little bit more time talking about the brand decks and like how I learned how to pitch an influencer. And so I might like lean a little bit more into that because it's relevant to the question that they asked. But this is like a really good foundation for a lot of different types of questions. And again, it's a very streamlined answer where I'm not spending too much time in the wrong places. I'm really focusing on the most important things of like, here's what I had to get done. Excuse me, here's how I did it. And here was like how much I crushed it. Does this make sense? Okay, I see thumbs up. Ashbury, let me know if that doesn't make sense. Okay, cool. I'm seeing thumbs up. All right. So what we're gonna do is we're gonna do some brainstorming together. So I'm gonna give y'all like 5 minutes, and I would love for you to just take some dirty notes for yourself, like napkin notes, however, like in your notes app, wherever you want to do it, and just start like rattling off ideas. Maybe you use just your resume and like you're just pulling from that, but start just making note of stories that maybe you already know you talk about. Maybe this slide sparks some ideas of like, oh, I didn't think about like turning that into an interview story. So let's take 5 minutes. It's the 48. So we'll reconvene at the 53. And just take some notes for yourself, and we'll like make them more structured and pretty later. This is just for you to start, like I said, brainstorming. So take 5 minutes and reconvene then. Let me know if you have questions. I'm right here. But 10-ish seconds since I know people are on mute. Good. Love to hear that. Yeah. Good. I think it's, yeah, I think I've literally seen people create like 20-page Google Docs of scripts, like trying to imagine literally every potential question that could ever come up. And if you have like a few really, again, really rich stories where there's a lot of good angles, that can be a great source. And I think another question that I will say comes up is like, is it okay to reuse the same experience in your interview? And it totally is, as long as you're like, again, touching on a different element. So like, in the like the SpongeBob example that I showed, if they asked about like brand deals, I would spend time like talking about how I went about like building brand deals. And if they had asked about like how did you manage a budget for the event, I can talk about the same campaign or talk about the same event, but I'd focus obviously much more on like the accounting piece. And it's okay because you're like, it's the same experience, but you're talking about a very different element of it that is relevant to the conversation. Great. Okay. So that's sort of like, those are the baseline things you want to think about going into every interview. But of course, like what's also important is to consider your audience and like the job you are in fact interviewing for. It's really striking. I have this conversation really often with recruiters who, again, they tend to mostly interview people who are straight out of college or like transitioning into the work, like, the office space for the first time. And they're like, it's so common that people come in and they've not read the job description or they don't know what they are really applying for. Last week, someone was saying like, the company I talked to last week, they're like, the main thing we hire for is like passion. Cause we think that we can teach people whatever and like we can get them up to speed. Like, we just want to know, are they really excited about this job? And we'll often go in interviews and I'll say like, so what do you know about the role? Like, what stood out to you? And they're like, oh, nothing. Like, I was waiting for you to tell me about the role. And that's a huge, huge miss. So don't fall into that trap. This is yeah, I know. I was like low-key really shook when I heard that. I was like, guys, what in this market, you cannot be doing that. So, anyways, so don't fall into that trap. It can totally happen, and no shame if it has happened to you, because I think, again, people often don't understand the key purpose of the interview, right? And part of the interview is you sharing not just like your skills and your background, and you're there to learn about the role, but you're trying to find a really personal way to stand out, again, in a particularly competitive market. So let's talk about like three elements of like preparing for an interview specific to the role. Yeah, 100%. People do hire for passion more than we think. So part of your job is to communicate that passion. So let's talk about how to do that. So again, you may not know what they're going to ask, but you do know that they're going to have some sort of question in the beginning of the interview, which is like either walk me through your resume, like tell me about yourself, like some sort of like introductory question, right? And you do know that is probably coming. So that is something you can prepare in advance, and that's something you can tailor to the audience. So 2 years ago, I did like 13 hours of interviews for a really senior position. And what was really interesting is even folks who like have a lot of work experience and have interviewed for 20 years, something that was really striking to me as somebody conducting the interviews is that we had like a very particular script we had come up with as the questions of like, we knew the 5 things we wanted to measure in the interview, the 5 like skills we wanted to focus on. We had like really thoughtful questions prepared. We had like sub questions prepared. And in the beginning we would ask like, so tell me about yourself. And some people would spend 10 minutes answering that question and then cut into the time that we had allotted to really get into the most important information that we needed to determine if they were the right fit for the role. So one of the big things is like, don't spend too much time at the front of the interview, like on setup again. So if they do ask you, like, tell me about yourself, walk me through your resume, whatever, keep that, walk me through your resume. You can go a little bit longer, but tell me about yourself should be really high level. So what I do is like, tell me where you are in your career right now. So I'm a graduating senior. I am a marketing associate. I am a PhD candidate, like whatever your thing is, like, where are you right now? High level overview of your most relevant and recent experiences, project skills. So this is again where if you haven't seen our cover letter exercises and toolkits on the Forward website, that's super helpful. But just like highlighting like for that position, like what are the most relevant headlines you want to hit them with, and why you are excited to be here today, like why this role really stood out to you. I particularly find that employers like hearing how you see this role fitting into the larger arc of your career. And you could be BSing. You're probably going to be BSing because you're probably just trying to get a job and like get an income, and that is okay. Don't tell them that. But you want to be able to articulate like, I've spent the last couple of years, I'm going to pretend I'm me as a senior. I've spent the last couple of years really passionate about South Asian affairs. Like I was president of the South Asian Society. I took several South Asian politics classes. I had the opportunity to do some really amazing work on the ground in India. And I'm excited about this particular position because it'll be an opportunity for me to bring together my passion for policy and South Asian culture together. And I think it's really going to help me because eventually I want to blah, blah, blah. This is, again, imagining this is a fake job I would be applying to, but I've hit them with the headlines of like, here's the relevant things that I've done related to South Asian policy, because this is the fake job I'm applying to in this example. And I've articulated that this is actually the perfect job for me next. It brings together everything I'm excited about. People love to hear that. They really lap that up because, again, one of the things that I found is if you are early career, which I think a lot of people in this room are, if you are early career, the reason employers hire early career is one, because they want to train you up and kind of get you up to speed. You're like a blank slate that they can train, but also because like those companies really believe in hiring early career talent and they want to see you succeed. So make them feel like they are going to be this like really amazing stepping stone in your career. Like that makes them feel good. So I'm going to pause here. I saw a comment in the chat. So this is a good tactical question. Keep it open in a tab just in case, but if the interviewer is doing their job, which often they are not, if the interviewer is doing their job, they should already have your resume up, even if they looked at it 30 seconds before, but they should have it. Yeah, I think it's a good question. I think it's both. I think that the blend is something along the lines of I know this job calls for XYZ skills. And this is, again, I actually pull a lot from my cover letter strategy, which is really like nicely laid out in the forward toolkits. A lot of my cover letter strategy carries over to this, which is like, when I looked at this job, I saw that you're looking for XYZ skills or experiences. I've done a lot of that in my previous work, or I've been doing that for the last couple of years. Like I landed as clients like this, or I was able to grow the business by like in this way. And so I feel really good that I could do the same thing for y'all. And this is a particular issue that I'm passionate about because of, fill in the blank. So you can definitely do both. And that's where part of this is like practicing your voice. So something that, because of this has been my job for the last 7 years of like talking people through this, I have found my interview voice. It sounds like me, it is very authentic to me, but I've like found my groove of how I like to talk in these settings. Part of this is going to be y'all finding your own groove in these settings. And it should sound like you, it should sound conversational, it should sound natural. But however you would phrase this concept of like, here are the things that I bring to the table and here's why I'm passionate about it, that takes a little bit of practice. So I literally like have voice noted myself, like voice recorded myself and like listen to how I talk. And like in the beginning, I was like, ooh, I sound like a robot. So it's okay so you want to bring in both of those elements and you want to do it in a way that sounds natural. So that was kind of like a roundabout way. Yeah, no worries at all. I'll be sending the video. So that's just something I wanted to call out. That was a bit of a roundabout. Okay. So the second pillar here, right? The role itself. So when you're thinking about preparing for an interview, go back to the job description. And again, I talk about this in my cover letter stuff as well. You should have when you applied for the job, but you'll do a refresher when you go to interview. Identify like what are the key themes that you're seeing in the job description? Like what are the top responsibilities or expectations. And there are even things that might not be like super obvious, like, but for example, a lot of startups or like smaller companies, you might have already noticed this in job descriptions. It'll be a lot of like, you have to be scrappy. You have to be able to work in a fast-paced environment. You have to be able to like manage yourself. Like it's a lot of that vibe, which is not necessarily bad. Some people really do well in that environment. But if you're seeing something like that, for example, like coming up over and over in the job description, have stories ready in your mind of when you've had to like do that, like when you've had to just sort of run with it and make things happen without a lot of information or a lot of resources. You've had to get up to speed quickly. Like it's not just the like, you're looking for a marketing person, here's when I've done marketing. What I've found is it's also those other things, which is what kind of environment have they set up for you? And like, are you the kind of person who would do well in that environment? So thinking about those kinds of stories and having those ready are really, really important. Again, you'll probably draw from those same stories that you were just brainstorming earlier, but you'll want to think about it through that lens. And it'll be those stories that are really important to feel super comfortable with. Another thing I'll name here is a common question that comes up for people is, well, what if I don't have direct experience in this job? Very, very common. Something that's important in an interview, especially if you've gotten to the interview stage, they like see something in you. So two things. One, transferable skills are relevant skills. What I mean by that is like, let's say you are applying for a job in tech sales, very lucrative, very fast paced, like it's a good place to get your foot in the door, but you've never worked in tech sales. So a lot of people will be like, oh, I am not qualified. I've never been in tech sales. If you've worked in a service job, in a hospitality job, you are definitely qualified for that job because you've been in fast-paced customer like service related roles. So rather than go into the interview and be like, oh yeah, I don't have that experience, say this job calls for, you know, really good people skills and really good problem solving skills for customers. When I was working as a hostess at the Lobster Shack, like here was a crazy experience that I had and how I was able to diffuse the situation. Like I am very comfortable working with all sorts of different clients and adapting really quickly. So like my example there being like, don't undercut yourself. Use the interview to make it super obvious that you have the skills, even if it was in a slightly different setting or a different industry. This is your opportunity to like name that up front. If you have a glaring skill gap, right? If it's like they're looking for someone who has like Excel experience and you're like, I haven't really used Excel. What I would do in that situation, if they ask the question, like be prepared for them to be like, hey, I noticed like this job is really Excel heavy. Have you had any experience with Excel? There's a few ways you could answer this. You could say like, I don't, but I've actually been taking like an Excel like LinkedIn learning course and I've been trying to get up to speed and I'm like halfway through that course and it's going really well, which is say that if it's true. Don't like totally lie in an interview. But that's one way you could do it. It's like you could literally get ahead of a skill gap that way. The other way you could do it is say like, I haven't used as much Excel. However, I'm really good at getting up to speed. For example, when I was doing this job, there was like this, I had to learn Salesforce in less than a week. And here were all the things that I did to learn Salesforce. And by the end of that week, not only was I fully up to speed, but I was like running the trainings for all the new people who joined the team on Salesforce. So I feel really confident that I could get up to speed on Excel really quickly. So this, again, like you can get ahead of maybe some of those things that you think might come up in preparing for really for interviews specific to the job. I'm going to pause again because I feel like I am throwing obviously a lot of information, but I'm going to pause here again and see if I can clarify or people have questions on that. Good. I feel like I'm talking a million miles a minute, but it's a lot of things to communicate. Okay. The third column is the company itself, right? This is a place that I think people really underestimate as an opportunity to shine. Again, with entry level or early career opportunities in particular, or roles where they're like a bunch of people applying for the job, which is like a lot of all jobs right now. On paper, you are probably going to look really similar to your competition, right? So like this is the thing that I say about this market in general is like there's just so many problems with like what's happening with the job market right now. Some of it is like big macroeconomic things, and some things are just like literally how job descriptions are written. Like at every layer, there's a problem, which is like a whole other talk that I could give that no one's asking for. But I think the thing that I really try and communicate to people is like, okay, if it's a really competitive market and everybody on paper looks pretty similar or is pretty competitive with one another, it's those little extra things that are going to make you stand out, which is why I'm going so deep and specific on interview prep here, because again, like being well spoken and having good stories and being able to like be memorable in these conversations is so critical. So when people ask you, why do you want to work here? It's so important to have a good answer. So I'll give you an example. Again, when I was running interviews for like my nonprofit a few years ago, we asked everybody like, why do you want to work here? And on the homepage of our website, it says like dismantling inequitable talent pipelines. Like that was our headline. And so when I went to an interview and somebody was like, and I'd be like, why do you want to work here? And they'd be like, oh, like I want to help dismantle inequitable talent pipelines. I'd be like, okay, literally says that on our homepage. Like Okay, I mean, that might be true. I believe that that's true, but like everybody's giving that answer. Whereas somebody who might say like, oh, I like the way that you create content that's super actionable, or they say, I really like the fact that you are industry agnostic, or I love that you are championing paid internships, or I love that as somebody who like struggled to find a paid internship, like you've created a really like simple system to better identify, like there's so many ways that you can make that answer memorable, and it can be in the deep level of research that you do, it can be in a personal connection that you have to the mission, it can be that there's like something about how that company does business that you respect, it could be the leadership team, but like really think about like, why do you want this job and why do you want to work at this company? So it's worth spending some time reflecting on that, because again, it's an opportunity to be really memorable when a lot of people might give super generic answers. The other thing is at the end of an interview, they'll probably say, like, do you have any questions for us? And again, I think this is a really underrated moment to be memorable in an interview. So, there are logistical things that you might have questions about. So this is also, keep in mind that like every interview you have is going to be a little bit different, right? Like usually, this is broad strokes. Usually that first interview might be like what's called a phone screen, right? You probably had one of those. It's just like an HR person or the recruiter does like a 15-minute or a 30-minute, like quick, like, who are you? What's your deal? Are you a real person? Like they keep it pretty high level. And that is like a stage where you might have, no worries. I'm so glad this was helpful. People might have questions on like how salary is structured or benefits or whatever. I would not like waste time on those questions unless you like really urgently need to know the answer to that question. I would be a little bit more thoughtful about the questions that I want to ask. So, for example, rather than asking like, what's a typical day in the life of this hire, which is a perfectly fine question, but again, a lot of people ask it, you could maybe ask something like, let's see, now I'm drawing a blank. You might ask something like, who was like the last person who was really successful in this role, and like, what do you think made them so successful in it? Or how has the current like economic environment like impacted the business? Or let's say you're applying to a federal, like a company that takes in a lot of federal dollars, like even having the foresight to be like, hey, like I know y'all get a lot of federal funding, like how is all the stuff that's happening with this administration impacting the way that y'all are thinking about business? Like you want to just show that you've put a little bit of thought into it. And again, like if you have real logistical questions, you can totally ask those too. But again, this is a space where people can be like, dang, that person like really thought about this and like really went deep and really came up with like an interesting, nuanced question. I have not been asked that question before. Those people, as somebody who's done a lot of interviewing, those people are super memorable. And so I'll pause here again and see if there's any thoughts. Or if there's spicy questions that y'all like to ask in interviews that maybe would be helpful for the rest of the group to hear. Exactly. Yeah. I think logistical questions, like one, just double check they aren't in the job description, because sometimes people ask questions that can be answered. And then yeah, logistical questions on like, what is the timeline of this hire, or like, you know, questions about benefits, whatever, like save those for email. Unless again, it's like super, super urgent. But yeah, email is a good forum for that. I think that's great. Asking like what kind of resources they offer for professional development is great. Because again, it speaks to like what you are looking for as well. Awesome. Okay. So as I have said multiple times, but I'm just reiterating it in big font here, is if you find those like 5 to 7, and I know 5 to 7 sounds like a lot, so you can, it might be fewer than that if you have like really like again rich stories behind it. But No worries. Thanks for being here, Katya. If you have those 5 to 7 stories, then and you use the STAR method, which we'll talk about next, that is where you will have so much that you can talk about going into interview paired with like the maybe job specific things that you're going to prepare ahead of time. So let's talk about the STAR method. This is not obviously my invention. This has been around a lot. You've probably heard this somewhere before, but let's just kind of revisit it quickly because I do think a lot of people still don't do this very well. And this is, again, a way for you to really shine in an interview. And I think something I want to name here in general is I think when I say things like this, where it's like, oh, this is a good way to stand out in an interview, it's not so much about like, oh, I'm checking a box and I'm like showing how professional I am by like doing the STAR method, because I think we can also name that this concept of what it is to be a professional can be unpacked, and that's a very complicated concept. It's very practical, right? Like part of what they are evaluating in interviews is not just like your skills and your experience, but your communication style. Like, do you know how to effectively understand the audience and get your point across? Because that's just really important practically in any job. So the STAR method is a really helpful framework for you to do that, because especially in that environment, you might be feeling obviously a lot of pressure. It might feel very stressful. Like you don't want to mess up. You don't want to ramble. The STAR method will keep you super grounded and show them that you do know how to communicate effectively. And that is something that they are looking for, right? So STAR, situation, task, action, result. Situation and task is where you should spend the least time. Action is where you should spend the most time, and result, you'll spend a little bit less than you would on results, right? So if you're thinking about like the breakdown, situation is like the setup, right? So it would be like the example we have here. When I was a marketing coordinator at the Krabby Patty, I had to plan an event and we had to raise $5,000. That's the situation, the task, right? That's like, here's what I was, here's what I needed to get done. So you keep it super simple. Super common mistake I see people make is they spend a lot of time on the setup. They'll, feel the need to explain the full context because it's what's actually sometimes feels easiest to talk about. But welcome back. No, you're good. Just in time for us to talk about the STAR method. So spend the least amount of time here. Again, we have this example where it's like, I spent 2 bullet points talking about situation and task. Action is where it's at, right? Because again, the purpose of the interview is to not see that you, not just like, oh, does this person know how to do it? They genuinely want to understand like how you problem solve, your thought process, how you would tackle it, because they're trying to imagine you in the job that they're hiring for. And if they can picture like how you would approach that job, given how you've approached previous jobs, it's just like much easier for them to advocate to hire you. So spending the most time on the action piece, which people often spend not enough time on, is really, really important. A common thing is like, I will say, I think, particularly if you are, identify as a woman, if you are femme presenting, like what I've found is for a lot of us, we do this thing where we want to give the team credit, where it's like, we did this, like I was part of a team that did that. That's great. I'm sure you were part of a team that did something. Use I statements. Use I statements. We're talking about you. We're talking about you today, right? So like, be very specific with the actions that you took and use I statements. And then what was the result of, I hear it all the time. I mostly work with women of color and we all do this. So I always like to name that. Everyone's cameras are off, so I can't really know who's in this room, but I'm just going to take a wild guess. So results is also important because it's like, okay, here are all the steps that I took, and then here is how I pulled it all together, and here was the impact of my work. All of those pieces are super important, but again, particularly action and result. So we've looked at this example already. It's just a very helpful way to see a way that you can script an answer that still sounds conversational. Like you don't want to sound like you are reading off of a piece of paper, but if you are somebody who, particularly if you're doing a Zoom interview and you get nervous, what I would recommend is have like a Google Doc page there, or maybe I'm a printout girly, so I like to have my like papers in front of me. Have your STAR story bullet points like sitting in front of you just to like use as you need them, but practicing them out loud over and over, and it'll come easily because again, these are your own experiences. So it should come naturally to you after a certain point of practice. I'm going to pause Because again, just firing off a lot of information. Questions, things I can clarify. Okay. So what we're going to do, you've taken some notes on stories. Let's just turn them into a star thing. This is related to asking questions, but a lot of times I don't feel like I can afford to ask questions I want to ask. Can you clarify what you mean by that? Okay, so like you want to get into the spicy questions. So this is okay, so if I'm understanding your point here, it's like you do want to get into some of those spicier questions, but you're worried about how it might, like it feels like too high stakes to ask the spicy questions. Like it's just like, yeah, okay. So I think that like my take, there's a few different ways that we can interpret spicy here, right? There's like trying to think, be thoughtful of how I phrase this. So they're spicy in that like you ask like really thoughtful questions about the industry, right? Where it's like, so for example, if you were applying to a green technology company and you wanted to go in and really impress the spicy question. Say like a few years ago, you know, Biden passed like the largest infrastructure bill that we've ever seen. Like, I'm curious if your company saw any benefit from that. And if there's been any like changes with like the new administration on how investment is coming towards green technology, like wondering if you can like share what y'all have observed. Like, that's a very good question. And like, that is showing that you are paying attention, that you're considering how like the larger world impacts like that industry. There's like that kind of spicy question. Then there's a spicy question, which is like hard hitting and more values driven. So like a question I think a lot of people are asking right now is like, are you still investing in your DEI department? Like that is like a genuinely spicy question right now, just in the context of the world we're living in. And but if that is something that is genuinely important to you and you're like, I do not want to work at a company that is divesting from DEI, then you should ask that question, because if you're not going to get a straight answer, then like you should know that now. So I think it's like, I guess that's sort of the spectrum of what I would say. But I actually think asking those really thoughtful industry questions, those are the ones that are going to make you stand out in a competitive market, right? Because I can tell you, like, everyone is asking, what is a day in the life of this hire? Everyone is asking, like, what makes this like, what will make this next hire successful? Those are not bad questions, but you are going to sound like every other person. If you want to give yourself the best leg up, be the memorable candidate in like a good way, obviously, but like be the memorable candidate. So I don't know if that example makes sense. Okay, that makes a lot of sense. Okay, I'm glad that makes a lot of sense. So ask the spicy questions if they were deal breakers to you. Because I think people should still have deal breakers. But you have to be really self-aware of like your own, like what those are for yourself. Yeah. Okay, I'm glad that made sense. Okay, great. Any other questions? Okay. I also want to just do a quick pulse check. Is anybody able to unmute today? And if you can't, that's totally fine. I just am trying to gauge the right way to spend the rest of our time together. Is anyone here able to unmute today?
I am able, ready, and willing.
Amazing. I appreciate that.
Do you recognize my voice, Miriam?
I was gonna be like, I feel like I know who this is, but I can't tell who this
Joe
is.
Grunbaum, Georgetown.
Oh, hello. Thank you for
Hey.
being here. Appreciate you being here and appreciate you being willing to unmute.
Yeah,
Is anyone else here able to unmute today? Just for the purposes, we'll do like a little bit of practice.
I can unmute like a little
Amazing.
bit. I'm just like in a public area, I guess. So there might just be people walking around. But yeah.
Okay, perfect. All right, so what we'll do is let's do another like kind of 5-7 minute working session. Joe, I'll pull up the slides of what we were doing, but let's take some of those stories that we were brainstorming early that we might bring up in an interview and format them into like a STAR method format, and just like practice putting that down. And then whoever is able to unmute, if they want to do just a practice round live of how they would answer the question. We can do some rapid fire real-time feedback only if you're comfortable. We can also always like talk about it separately, but that's kind of the main thing we have left for the rest of this session. So I'm going to go ahead and pull up this example that I used. And it's 25. So let's give it 6-7 minutes. I'll start a clock, and then we'll do a little bit of practice and we'll wrap it up from there. Any questions before we do that? Okay, perfect.
Sounds good.